There is a vast, uncharted region of territory known as the Northwest Territories that may be found at the farthest northernmost part of Canada. This is an area of unadulterated, breathtaking beauty. The globe is filled with vast forests, rugged mountains, and rivers that are both powerful and winding. In order to provide you with an idea of the magnitude of this single land, it is 4 times larger than the entirety of the country of Germany. Nevertheless, the Northwest Territories have a population of approximately 50,000 people, in contrast to Germany, which is home to more than 80 million people. This location is among the most inaccessible, rugged, and sparsely populated areas on the entire planet. A land that is truly wild. In addition, a valley may be found smack dab in the middle of this enormous wilderness. A region of terrain that is 10,000 square miles in size and is so remote and difficult to access that it is thought that there are still parts of it that no human being has ever set foot in. The Nahanni Valley is the name given to this location. Over the course of several centuries, the Nahanni Valley has been a site of lore, a location that has been discussed in hushed tones between campfires among people. The indigenous peoples of the area have said for a long time that it is a place that should be avoided. Dark ghosts and odd happenings can be found in this location. The Naha were notable for being one of the first known tribes to attempt to establish a home there. The valley was their home for a period of time, but eventually, for reasons that are not clear, they disappeared. Suddenly, they vanished, leaving behind a vibrant community that had been there for a day with them. As if they had just vanished into the thin, chilly air, all of their possessions, including their pottery, their tools, and their dwellings, were left behind. It was only in their writings that they left any traces behind. In their writing, they described odd animals that were pallid and hunted the forests at night. White devils, or Swahila, was the name they gave to them. From the beginning of their writings, they were overwhelmed with an ever-increasing sense of fear regarding these aliens, and suddenly, they simply stopped writing. The Naha had passed away. The other tribes that inhabited in the area did not completely disappear, but they did run away. As they packed up their belongings and left the valley, they vowed that they would never return, therefore establishing the Nahanni as a location that was both cursed and forbidden. These were merely thought to be old tales, folklore that was intended to keep people away for a considerable amount of time. At the beginning of the 20th century, however, a sequence of actual events began to take place in the Nahanni Valley. The occurrences were so peculiar and terrible that they gave the impression that the old legends might not be legends at all. The true beginning of our story takes place in 1904, with 3 brothers. Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod were the 4 individuals in question. Gold prospectors who lived and worked in the Northwest Territories were the toughest and most experienced individuals in the industry. It was common knowledge that they were familiar with the tales that were told about the Nahanni Valley. They were well aware that it was regarded as a foreboding and even haunted location. In contrast, a gold prospector may view a location that everyone else is too terrified to explore as an opportunity to pursue their interests. Assuming that no one had entered the room, they reasoned that the gold must have been taken by no one. The Nahanni Valley is a place that is so beautiful and unspoiled that it is impossible for there not to be gold there. Consequently, the 3 McLeod brothers made the decision that they were going to be the ones to face the valley, despite the cautions and the horrible legends that were spoken about it. They said their goodbyes to their family, gathered their belongings, and then embarked on their journey through the wilderness. The process of entering the valley was a challenge in and of itself. At that time, there were no highways or actual trails. The decision to travel by boat meant that they would have to endure a difficult trek upriver. They had to cross perilous waters, and at numerous points, they were required to physically disassemble their boat, take the pieces of lumber and their gear up and past large waterfalls, and then reconstruct the boat on the opposite side of the river. Although it was a difficult and grueling process that would have deterred the majority of people, the McLeods were unwavering in their commitment. In due time, the effort that they put in paid off. Ironically, the Flat River is a violent and turbulent river that slices through the middle of the valley. They arrived to the primary waterway that provides access to the valley. In order to find a little section of beachfront where they could beach their boat and set up a camp, they maneuvered through its rapids until they discovered it. They found themselves encircled by enormous mountains and deep trees that were completely silent. Despite the fact that it was a frightening environment, they were there for a specific cause. As they entered the icy river, they retrieved their equipment, including their sluices, and continued their journey. They located it almost shortly after search. Golden. And it's not just a few bits of snow. It was difficult to believe. One might get the impression that the entire riverbed was glistening with it. Over the course of several days, from dawn to dusk, they labored tirelessly to extract an extraordinary quantity of gold from water. This was the score of a lifetime, beyond everything they could have ever imagined achieving. Finally, they had amassed such a large quantity of gold that they were unable to physically transport any more of it. Their boat was completely full, and they were aware that it was time to depart, sell their discoveries, and then make preparations for a subsequent journey. As they began their journey back down the Flat River, they arrived at their destination in a positive frame of mind. They had a lot of money. They were successful in their gamble. It was clear that the valley would not allow them to go without a fight. During the course of their journey across a particularly turbulent stretch of the river, their overloaded boat became entangled in the stream, causing it to capsize. Anything and everything was hurled into the water that was churning in an instant. Despite being drenched in water and shivering, the brothers were able to safely make their way to the shore. As they retrieved their rifles and the few supplies they were able to recover, they discovered that the gold had been completely depleted. It was gone for all time, having sunk to the bottom of the swiftly running river due to its depth. Even though they were in utter disarray, they managed to pull through. They were aware that there was further gold on the other side of that. So they went back to the spot where they had initially set up their tent. They made preparations to begin their journey anew in the morning and put up their tent. They arose early the following morning and once again made their way to the river, returning to the very same location where they had discovered a fortune just a few days before. On the other hand, there was nothing this time. In spite of spending the entire day excavating, sluicing, and hunting for flake, they were unable to locate even a single one. As if the gold had disappeared, the Naha tribe had also disappeared at the same time. They remained for a few more days, but they were aware that they needed to go because their supplies were running low and their boat was no longer available. They were able to live, and they were aware that the valley contained a hidden riches that was sufficient for the time being. They began the long and painful journey out of the valley on foot, packing up what little they had left and packing up their belongings. Willie and Frank, the two younger brothers, were more determined than they had ever been before when they finally made it back to civilization. They had already begun contemplating their subsequent journey. In spite of the fact that they had saw the gold with their own eyes, they were not going to allow a single obstacle to deter them. However, Charlie, the family's oldest brother, had a different opinion. The encounter had left him feeling unsettled. When they were out there, by themselves in that huge desert, he couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to passing away. He conveyed to his brothers that he would not be returning. Even though he was certain that they would most likely discover further gold, he wished them luck. However, his time in the Nahanni Valley had come to an end. Willie and Frank were dissatisfied, but they were sympathetic to the situation. They discovered a guy named Robert Weir, who was willing to join them in their endeavor. The new Weir family, consisting of Willie, Frank, and Robert Weir, embarked on their journey 1 year later, at the beginning of 1905, with the intention of returning to the Nahanni Valley. Everyone in their community was aware of their intended destination and the things they were looking forward to discovering. They did not have a predetermined date for their return. A journey of this nature could have lasted for several months or even a whole year back in those days. You simply went, and by the time you returned, you had already returned. After a few weeks, months passed. It was a shift of seasons. For the entirety of the year, Willie, Frank, and Robert did not communicate with one another in any way. People in the village began to feel anxious, but Charlie, the brother who had remained behind, calmed everyone, removing their concerns. He informed them that his brothers had a lot of experience. They had a sense of what they were doing. He described the valley as challenging but not insurmountable. He reassured everyone that they should not be concerned. On the other hand, another year went by. Now, the year was 1907. Over the course of 2 full years, his brothers had made their way into that valley. Even Charlie was unable to dispute the fact that something was awry at this point. The amount of time that had passed without any communication was simply too lengthy. He was aware that he needed to go and look for them. He assembled a search group consisting of 4 other men, and together they embarked on a journey into the Nahanni Valley. They followed the same perilous path that he had traveled with his brothers many years earlier. After leading his men up the flat river, Charlie headed in the direction of the same shoreline where they had slept earlier. Upon arrival at the location, they discovered that his siblings and their camp had vanished without a trace. They proceeded on their way, making further inroads into the valley. At that point, the river made a dramatic turn that was almost 90 degrees, and this location is known as the Big Bend. As a result of this turn, they entered a portion of the valley that is commonly referred to as Second Canyon. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. On either side of them, the walls of the canyon climbed higher, giving the impression of steep cliffs that rose thousands of feet into the sky. Because of the steepness of the walls and the proximity of the walls to the water, there was no space for a boat to land. Once you entered Second Canyon, you were obligated to travel 10 miles in this claustrophobic passageway that was completely dark. The wind howled down the canyon, producing a peculiar sound that was similar to whistling and nearly sounded like a moan. They were able to see the dark holes of hundreds of caverns from a prominent vantage point on the cliff walls, which appeared to be empty eyes watching them pass by. The location felt spooky and frightening to be in. Later on, the guys would assert that they had the unsettling and persistent sensation that they were being observed at all times. As they made their way through the canyon, which was 10 miles long, they searched the water and the cliffs for any indication that the guys had gone missing inside. They were eventually able to emerge from the stifling shadow of Second Canyon, and as they did so, the valley suddenly became more open. This location, once again, included a few isolated stretches of shoreline, and they got a glimpse of it on one of those quaint beaches farther up ahead. It is a tent. Their hearts leapt for joy. While they were calling out the names of Willie and Frank, they navigated their boat in the direction of the beach. They quickly made their way to the campsite when they beached the boat. They noticed a figure sleeping on the ground close to some trees as they came closer to the position. It was a man who was unconscious and lying on his back, with his arm extended in a manner that suggested he was attempting to grab the weapon that was leaning against a nearby tree. After that, they discovered another body, this one lying face down, and partially within the tent and partially outside of it. They were getting closer, as the horrific reality of the situation grew more and more apparent. The heads of both of the males were out of place. Charlie was able to determine the identities of the deceased by using personal belongings that were discovered at the camp. Willie and Frank were his brothers. They were his brothers. Robert Weir seemed to be nowhere to be found. A search group went around the camp looking for anything. The etching was discovered by them cut into the tree at the location where the weapon was leaning. It stated, "We have found a fine prospect." This gave the impression that they had discovered gold. Nevertheless, a comprehensive investigation of the camp and the riverbank in the vicinity led to the discovery of nothing. There was not a single ounce of gold ever discovered. The event was really unsettling to witness. One of the brothers was obviously reaching for his firearm at the time of his death. It seemed as though the other individual had been attempting to escape from the tent. Moreover, their heads were completely absent. After collecting as much information as they could, Charlie and his men left the valley, bearing the weighty news of what they had discovered before them. They informed the mounted police about all that had happened. The authorities began their own inquiry into the matter. However, despite the fact that they discovered another skeleton a little distance downstream, which was also missing its head, they refused to identify it as belonging to Robert Weir. The official conclusion that they came to was that Willie and Frank had simply passed out due to malnutrition and that animals had taken their heads off of them. Charlie was angry with rage. He was well aware that this was not logical. What was written on the tree, where the bodies were located, and what was missing from the heads. As a whole, it indicated that there was something violent and something sinister. The case, however, was resolved. On the other hand, the news quickly traveled throughout the Northwest Territories like wildfire to everyone. A horrifying new chapter had been added to the story of the valley that was said to be cursed. Additionally, beginning on that day, the region of the Nahanni Valley that encompassed Second Canyon all the way to the location where the McLeod brothers were discovered was renamed accordingly. Eventually, people began to refer to it as the Headless Valley. A small number of people had the courage to trek inside the Nahanni during the subsequent few years. In addition to being too recent, the narrative of the McLeod brothers was also too terrifying. In order to entice people to enter a location where men lost their heads, the promise of wealth was not sufficient attraction. But recollections are short-lived, and greed is a potent driver of behavior. 5 years after the brothers were discovered, in 1913, a prospector by the name of Martin Jorgensen made the decision that he was courageous enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to try his luck at finding the brothers. As a solitary individual, he was a hardy outdoorsman who was confident in his ability to deal with anything the valley had in store for him. At a distance of approximately 70 miles from the Headless Valley, he ventured into the Nahanni region by himself, and, rather than establishing a temporary camp, he constructed a modest and durable hut for himself. Because he was confident that he would make his fortune there, he intended to remain for an entire year. And it appeared that he was correct for a period of time. Due to the fact that he was able to communicate the news to his business associates, we are aware that he discovered gold. A straightforward and victorious message was sent. It seemed as though he had hit it rich. Once a year had passed, he instructed them to meet him at a location that had been prearranged outside of the valley. After a year had passed, his companions made their way to the scheduled meeting location. Even though they waited, Martin Jorgensen did not appear at any point. Due to the fact that this was absolutely out of character, his partners made the decision to descend into the valley in order to locate him. They were armed with the directions that he had sent. As they continued to follow his track, they were eventually able to locate the site of his cabin. However, the cabin was no longer there. What was left behind was nothing more than a heap of burnt wood and ash. It had been entirely consumed by fire and gone up in flames. In addition, the decapitated body of Martin Jorgensen was discovered lying on the ground close to the decaying remains of the cabin. To reiterate, there was no gold to be discovered anywhere in the area. It was decided to call in the mounted police once more. Yet another investigation was carried out by them. Again, they came up with an explanation that was completely in line with the natural world. They came to the conclusion that Jorgensen must have used his stove in a way that caused an accident, which was the cause of the fire. Predation by animals was the cause of the missing head, as was the case with the lost head. It was yet another case that had been resolved, yet another horrible event that occurred in the harsh woods. However, the trend was becoming increasingly difficult for many people to ignore. 8 years later, in 1921, John O'Brien and an anonymous partner, 2 other prospectors, made the decision to test their luck and see what would happen. Despite the fact that they were aware of the tales, they were of the belief that there was a return for every risk. The Headless Valley itself was not too far away from where they established their tent. And very immediately, they discovered gold, just like the others had done. They disseminated the news that they had achieved their goals and that they intended to remain for a considerable amount of time. It had been a couple of weeks since they had begun their journey, and they were getting low on food. Along the path that they used to enter the valley, they had placed a number of animal traps in various locations. For the purpose of examining the traps, John O'Brien informed his partner that he was going to make the journey. It was a lengthy trek that would take him 8 or 9 days to complete, and it was a circuit. For the sake of protecting their wealth and supplies, his partner remained in the camp with them. In spite of the passage of 9 days, John O'Brien did not come back. His companions started to feel concerned about him. It was by accident that he came upon another solitary prospector who was in the vicinity, and the two men decided to undertake the mission of searching for O'Brien together. They continued to call his name as they followed the line of traps. They walked for a considerable amount of time. At the moment when the sun was beginning to drop, they entered a tiny clearing. One of the fallen logs was located in the middle of the clearing. In addition, there was a man who was seated on the log with his back to them. "John, is that you?" they yelled out, but there was no response to their question. Completely still, the figure remained in that position. They moved closer with increased caution. They made their way around the log, and as they did so, they saw that it was, in fact, John O'Brien. He was sitting in an upright position, his demeanor uninterested, and he was simply staring into the ashes of a small bonfire that had been extinguished at his feet. He had a book of matches in his hand, and he was holding it tightly. In addition, he had been fully and utterly frozen to death. It was a peculiar fact that the temperature had not been very low. The police, who later inspected the site, said in their report that it appeared as though he had been slain so suddenly that he had no time to react, no time to even realize what was happening. They said that it was as if he had been flash frozen. In the midst of the forest, he remained still, like a statue completely frozen in place. At this point, the stories were stacking up. Burned cabins, headless bodies, and a guy frozen solid make up the scene. The authorities continued to explain that each of these instances was distinct and unrelated to one another, and that they were simply the brutal facts of living in the wild. However, the general public was not entirely convinced. There was a widespread consensus that the Nahanni Valley was a haunted and cursed location at this point. Then, in the year 1926, an event that was both one of the most peculiar and chilling of all time occurred. In the valley, a wealthy hunting party made their entrance. There were perhaps 12 of them, and they were being guided by an experienced guide. It was their belief that there was protection in numbers. They established their camp in close proximity to the river, not too far from the Headless Valley. Nothing of note happened on the first day. After going on a hunt, they went back to their camp and spent the evening around a large bonfire, enjoying each other's company while exchanging stories. They awoke the following morning to discover that one of their party members had vanished without a trace. Annie Lafferty, a young woman, became absent from the scene. She had not yet removed her possessions from her tent. There was no note, and there was no indication that there had been a struggle. In the middle of the night, she had simply disappeared without a trace. The group spent the entire day looking for her, searching the woods and shouting her name numerous times, but they were unable to locate any trace of her. Eventually, they were forced to leave the valley and declare her missing to the authorities. An extensive and official search procedure was initiated. Because her family was so powerful and wealthy, they spared no cost in their spending. But after a number of weeks of hunting, they came up empty-handed. The valley itself seemed to have engulfed Annie Lafferty, as if she had been consumed by it. A man named Charlie, who was known for his solitude and his love of the outdoors, was found in a pub in one of the smaller villages located in the Northwest Territories a few months later. Some men were discussing the mysterious disappearance of Annie Lafferty, and he overheard them talking about it. A look of horror appeared on his face as he listened to the specifics of the incident, including the date and the location. It dawned on him that he had been present. Something had been observed by him. His astonishing narrative was promptly relayed to the authorities, and he went to the police station. During the period when the hunting team was stationed in the Nahanni Valley, he explained that he had been camping by himself in the valley. Even in the evening, he was close enough to them that he could hear their voices. He was not too far away. It was the night that Annie vanished, and he claimed that he was unable to sleep. It was while he was sitting outside his tent that he became aware of a peculiar sound. The sound that could be heard was that of little rocks being dropped into the river, one after the other. The sound was not a natural one, like the sound of rock slides. It appeared to be intentional. He stood up and made his way towards the riverbank in a stealthy manner in order to gain a better glimpse. It was a full moon, and it was shining brightly, which illuminated the area. He turned his gaze downstream, in the direction of the position of the hunting party's camp. He then became aware of it. A woman was climbing up a high, rocky ridge that ran alongside the river while she was absolutely naked. She was on all fours. Unlike a coyote, she was traveling at an unnaturally fast speed, similar to that of an animal. Both her hands and her feet were responsible for the dislodging of small stones, which then fell down the bank and splashed into the river with each step that she took. His ears had been picking up on that particular sound. He stood there, still, observing her in silence. It seemed to him that she was completely insane, and that she would perish from exposure out there. Nevertheless, she came to a halt just as she reached the highest point of the ridge. It appeared as though she was looking right at him when she moved her head. In addition, Charlie reported to the authorities that her face had been contorted into a frightening and inhumane grimace. As he described it, her eyes appeared to be utterly possessed. Because he was so afraid, he stumbled backward and hurried back to his tent, where he might find refuge from the danger. Over the crest of the ridge, the woman disappeared without a trace. Charlie was shown an image of Annie Lafferty, the woman who had gone missing, despite the fact that the police were still doubtful. Without any sign of doubt, he acknowledged it. He had seen the woman rushing naked on all fours into the dark core of the Nahanni Valley. That was the woman he had seen. There was no further sighting of Annie. The number of victims proceeded to reach new heights. In 1931, a prospector by the name of Phil Powers constructed a cabin, discovered gold, and then vanished without a trace. His charred cabin was discovered by a search party that had been sent out. Although the body of Powers was found inside, the investigation discovered that the fire had begun on the roof, which indicates that he would have had a sufficient amount of time to flee the building. As a result, it was determined that it was highly probable that he had already passed away inside his cabin before the fire even began. The year 1936 saw the disappearance of two other prospectors, namely William Epper and Joseph Mulholland. In addition, their cottage was discovered to be completely destroyed by fire. However, this time there were no remains found at all. Simply put, they had disappeared. At the campsite where he was staying in 1945, the body of a guy named Ernest Sabard was discovered inside his sleeping bag. Additionally, he was a prospector who had vanished without a trace. The search crew discovered him without his head when they found him. The year 1946 saw the occurrence of the last important incident. An additional large search party was dispatched to the area in an effort to locate a missing prospector by the name of John Patterson. The individual who was in charge of this search party was a man who was resolute, unyielding, and unwavering in his commitment to unraveling the enigma. They established their fortifications in the Headless Valley, which was the same region in which the McLeod brothers had been discovered. They were sitting around their fire one evening when, all of a sudden, a man emerged from the shade of the forest. The native man wore traditional garb and was dressed in traditional garb. Immediately, he approached the person who was in charge of the search party. His name was not disclosed by him. This is a terrifying warning that he just issued. After that, he informed them that they had to depart the valley without delay. According to him, there were white creatures that were walking around in the woods all around them, and they were very close to their camp. Before the leader of the search group could ask any questions, the man turned around, walked back into the forest, and vanished without a trace. All of the members of the search team were terrified that night by the horrific sounds that emanated from the forest that were all around them. In addition to the sound of enormous trees smashing to the ground, they heard screams and wails that went through their bodies. It was reported by a few of the men that they had witnessed tall white figures moving between the trees that were located on the edge of the firelight. As soon as the sun rose the following morning, they decided to give up their hunt for John Patterson and get away from the valley completely. In a later statement, the leader of the party, the individual who had entered the valley with such a high level of self-assurance, stated that he had never been more terrified in his entire life and that he would never again set foot in that valley. We were never able to locate John Patterson. After that, it appeared as though the odd occurrences in the Nahanni Valley had stopped. However, this is primarily due to the fact that people stopped going in. There were now too many of them, they were too consistent, and they were too terrifying to remain ignored. Thereafter, in the year 1976, the Government of Canada took an unusual action. National park status was bestowed upon the Nahanni Valley by the government. On the surface, it appeared as though this was a move to preserve the natural beauty of the area. In contrast, if you examine the park's regulations in greater detail, you will notice something peculiar. The area does not have any tourist facilities, visitor centers, or trails that are clearly marked. And perhaps most importantly, there are significant portions of the park that have been designated as being completely off-limits to visitors. Nobody is permitted to enter these areas at any time. Neither visitors nor researchers, and not even employees of the park. In addition, the Headless Valley serves as the focal point of the largest of these restricted areas. There is still a legal prohibition against entering the very locations where all of these strange and horrifying events took place, and this prohibition continues to this day. There are a lot of people who think that the government did not establish the park in order to protect the valley from people. They are under the impression that it was designed to shield people from whatever is located in the valley. Annie Lafferty continued to be a mystery, and the mystery of what happened to all of those prospectors has not been solved. The Nahanni Valley is a place where no one is permitted to look, and it is there that the valley conceals its information. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? As usual, 5-6-year-old Yoshika Yasutake dusts a piano in her family's small, clean Helmsley home on the 15th of April, 2018. Yoshika lifted the piano lid and dusted each key after dusting the outside. However, she was careful not to press any keys accidentally and make a sound. She wanted to avoid that. Yoshika always dreaded going to the piano when she cleaned the house because she was afraid of making a sound. Yoshika lowered the piano lid after dusting it inside and out, then dusting each book in a bookcase next to a window. As she did, she heard birds chirping, cars driving, and people talking out the window. After hearing this, Yoshika stopped dusting and looked out the window at the beautiful town. All the roadside stone cottages were glowing in spring sun. Yoshika felt sad about all the things she was missing as she looked out and listened to her village. Yoshika was a world-class pianist. She played packed symphony halls after studying at London's Royal College of Music. Sometimes royal family members were in the audience. She was huge. Yoshika stopped playing the piano after her younger sister Rina returned home. Yoshika became angry when she thought of Rina and turned to stare at her closed bedroom door. Just briefly, Yoshika wished Rina hadn't come home. Because since Rina came home, Yoshika's family seemed to have prioritized nothing else. Only Rina mattered. Yoshika, Rina, and Takahiro, their 51-year-old brother, comprised the Yasutake family. The 80-year-old mother of the three siblings lived with them. Their father died several years earlier. Yoshika and Takahiro were impressive in different ways. Both Yoshika and Takahiro were great pianists and writers. But Rina was better. Rina could speak Greek, Latin, English, Japanese, and her own dialect with a grammar system. Rina was an amazing artist, and everyone wanted her paintings. Rina refused to sell. Maybe she did, but rarely. But that only hyped her art. Getting a Rina painting was so valuable. Rina received scholarships to prestigious private schools as a child, and after graduating high school, she received a full-ride scholarship to Cambridge, one of the world's top universities. Everyone thought Rina would become a world-famous artist. There was something dark inside Rina that no one could identify. Only when she had sudden outbursts of anger did people see this side of her that didn't fit with the rest of her. These anger outbursts were brief, so people dismissed them as a sign of extreme genius. Her brain sometimes couldn't handle how smart she was, and she got mad and frustrated. Rena was completely different when she returned home after graduating from Cambridge. It was like something inside her broke and stayed broken. Reno, had a sudden outburst of anger 2 days after returning home. Rena's rage persisted. After days of rage, her family asked her what was wrong. However, Rena refused to discuss it. Rena eventually locked herself in her family home bedroom and refused to speak to her family for weeks. Rena was different when she emerged after several weeks. She rarely spoke to family members unless necessary. She rarely left the house or her room unless necessary. This was not Rena's post-college phase. It became Rena's life. She stayed in that bedroom for decades, so much so that the family's neighbors didn't know she existed. Yoshika returned to the books on the shelf after staring at her sister's closed bedroom door. She cleaned the house after dusting them. She dropped the duster, and Yoshika quietly tiptoed to Rena's closed bedroom door. She knocked softly. Rena hated loud noises, so Yoshika couldn't play the piano because it disturbed her. After Yoshika's light knock, she mentally counted to 30. Rena told her not to come in right away. If you knock and wait 30 seconds, I may let you in. Yoshika mentally counts 1, 2, 3. Then Rena tells Yoshika, okay, you can enter from inside the room. Slowly turning the knob, Yoshika opened her sister's bedroom door. It revealed this pitch-black room. Small, cramped space. Rena sat silently on her bed with all the shades and blinds drawn. So Yoshika kept her head down and avoided looking at Rena. She wanted to avoid upsetting her. Yoshika entered the room and picked up Rena's dirty dishes from the table. Yoshika turned and left again. As she did, she glanced at Rena's bedroom project. Rena had told her family she was doing this master's work, but wouldn't say more. To work on this masterwork, she needed a dark room, a quiet house, and complete focus. Family support was needed as she did this. Rena never defined this masterwork. She said it was special and combined all her life's elements. Spirit, body, soul. Even the family would build this masterpiece. Rena replied, oh, you'll know when the time is right, when her family asked how they could help her make this master work. Yoshika couldn't see the master work, so she turned her head back down and shuffled out of Rena's room, closing the door. Yoshika then went to the kitchen and dumped Rena's dishes in the sink, which was already clean because Rena's rule was to keep the house clean. Clean dishes, no dust. It had to be perfect. She could only work on this masterwork if she was always clean. Her brother, Takahiro, entered the kitchen as Yoshika cleaned and dried Rena's dishes and put them away. He would tell Yoshika they should leave the house and go to the market to buy Rena some supplies so she could keep working on this master work. Since everything was about Rena, Yoshika was furious that they had to do this. She hid her feelings and told her brother to let go. Takahiro viewed Rena differently than Yoshika. Yoshika hated Rena because now that she was home, she had to give up her career as a great pianist to help Rena with her master's work. However, Takahiro was happy to give up writing to support Rena. Because he believed in Rena and thought her master work would be the greatest art in human history, Takahiro was proud to participate. Takahiro and his family didn't know what this masterwork was. Takahiro and Rena got along better than Yoshika and Rena. Rena told Takahiro what she needed to build this masterwork. Rena told Takahiro what she needed that day, so he and Yoshika went to get it. Takahiro and Yoshika donned jackets and left. After getting out there, they both flipped their collars up, covered their faces, and leaned down. Because they avoided eye contact with others. This family was already private, but Rena told them to be even more private and not interact with others. They would hide when out in public. Yoshika and Takahiro went to the pharmacy. They sneaked in and bought surgical spirits, a medical alcohol. After buying that, the brother and sister put their collars back up and went outside to an old used bookstore to buy a palm reading book which uses hand lines to predict the future. When the brother and sister bought this book, they kept their heads down and didn't speak to the cashier. The brother and sister rushed home after getting their book. They arrived to find the door locked. Instead of opening their own door, the brother and sister knocked and waited. They heard 4 locks turning when their mother came to the door. Yoshika and Takahiro entered, closed the door, and locked the 4 deadbolts. Rina insisted that no family member carry a house key. It was too risky to lose the key in town and have someone enter their house and see Rina's work. They could not allow that. No one had keys. Each return home required knocking. Rina was worried about someone entering the house and seeing what she was doing, so they had 4 locks on the door. To Rina's closed bedroom door, Yoshika carried the bag with the surgical spirits and palm reading book. Yoshika placed the bag outside the door, turned around, and left without knocking. As she did, she heard Rina's door open slightly. Yoshika turned around and saw a tiny, skinny arm reach out from behind the door. The bag was grabbed and pulled back into the room, closing and locking the door. Helmsley was a quiet village where unusual events were noticed. Stone houses were older than trees, and the residents had lived in the valley for generations. Their quiet lives were nice. But the Yasutakes had always puzzled them. They were polite when they spoke, but they were so rare they could have been ghosts. They moved to the UK years ago and settled in this small cottage. The town initially liked them because their sister was a famous pianist and their brother was a writer. But the family had cloaked themselves in silence for years. They were like a fortress in a quiet English town. 3 days later, on the 18th of April 2018, Yoshika was reading in the kitchen when she heard her brother Takahiro talking to Rina. Takahiro and Rina were no longer talking face to face. Rina was in her bedroom with the door closed, and Takahiro was sitting on the ground with his back to the door talking to her. Unlike Yoshika and Rina, who had a bad relationship and rarely talked, Takahiro and Rina had a good relationship and did this often. They talked for hours through the door. Yoshika briefly ignored her brother and sister's chatter and returned to her book. However, she started hearing her brother's words, which was strange. After putting down her book, she started listening to Takahiro. His question was how to do that without making sense. How? Your soul alone. How? How? Yoshika sensed her brother's confusion and possible upset. She couldn't resist. She put her book down, and Yoshika walked out to the living room, looking down at her brother for a hint. He and Rina stopped talking when Takahiro saw Yoshika and shook his head, stood up, and left. After Takahiro left, Yoshika quietly walked over to Rina's bedroom door and pressed her ear against the wood to see if she could hear Rina and catch something she was saying to explain what she had heard. But all she heard was Rina slowly shuffling toward her bed in the back of her bedroom. Complete silence followed. Yoshika left the door and returned to the kitchen to read again. She could not focus on the book because a wave of sadness was washing over her. Yoshika felt this way because she was thinking about how close she and Rina were as kids. Very close for most of their lives. Even after Rina became reclusive, they remained friends. But something happened 5 years earlier in 2013 that ended their relationship forever. Rina came out of her bedroom that day, and Yoshika offered to read her palm. The sisters occasionally did this for each other. It helped them bond. Rina extended her hand, and Yoshika traced a long horizontal line on her palm. Rina had unusual hands. Simian lines on palms are rare. Rina had one. It resembles a hand-length horizontal line. Simian lines in palm reading can be good or bad. It may indicate a mystic or visionary. So that's good. It could mean they're aggressive or have a terrible disease. The downside, Rina thought her simian line was good. She claimed visionary soul. On this day in 2013, the family was banned from a local supermarket because Rina got upset with some staff members and screamed and yelled at them. So they were banned. Yoshika contemplates this and looks at Rina's palm, saying the simian line. You may have been aggressive at the supermarket because of this. Perhaps you're aggressive. However, Rina was so offended that she whipped her hand back and yelled at Yoshika, calling her an idiot and saying, you don't understand my vision. I'll show the world this vision someday, and you and those grocery store idiots won't understand. Rina then punched and kicked Yoshika. Yoshika screams and defends herself. Takahiro, the brother, ran in to separate them. Rina was prone to angry outbursts, but this was her first physical attack. So Rina's mother worried she had a condition that caused her to lash out physically. Rina went to the doctor. The doctor would say, there's no physical cause. However, Rina appears to be having a mental breakdown and needs psychiatric treatment, maybe even hospitalization. Rina rejected treatment and blamed Yoshika for everything. Rina stopped leaving her bedroom after that. She used to leave every couple of months, but now she stays 24/7. Rina added all these new rules for her family to follow so she could focus on her masterwork in her bedroom. Nobody had house keys and added those 4 locks to the door. The family was also instructed to learn Rina's new Japanese dialect. None would understand what they were saying. It would further shield them from outside evils. Rina also made sure her family got rid of their phones, TVs, and computers. Yoshika sat in the kitchen longer, thinking about how sad she was to lose contact with her sister. Yoshika regretted her simian line remarks. As usual, Yoshika pushed her feelings for Rina down and returned to reading her book. Yoshika saw her brother Takahiro sitting against Rina's bedroom door more often than usual, carrying on hushed conversations with Rina for several weeks. Yoshika noticed Takahiro cooking all Rina's meals. Takahiro seemed to have taken over cooking Rina's food from their mother. Yoshika collected Rina's dirty dishes because she was in charge of cleaning the house. As soon as Takahiro started cooking for Rina, Yoshika noticed more food on her plates. Rina was eating less than usual. This alarmed Yoshika. Rina was small already. Only 90 pounds, she was 4 foot 11 inches tall. Yoshika worried that she must eat. She is too small to skip meals. One day in mid-May, Yoshika entered Rina's bedroom and saw that all her dishes were full of the food she had been given. She hardly touched them. Yoshika actually never spoke to Rina in the bedroom, but she couldn't resist this time. Without looking at Rina Yoshika, she gathered up the plates of food and told her to eat more. Rina remained silent. Yoshika turned and left the room quickly. After that, Takahiro told Yoshika, Rina doesn't want you in her room again. Rina will now put your dishes outside the door. Thus, you avoid entering that room. Around the same time, Rina, who usually only left her bedroom to use the bathroom, started doing so at night when her family was asleep to avoid them. Rina had almost no family interactions by this point. Rina sent Takahiro and Yoshika to the store more and more in early August to buy surgical spirits and medical alcohol. Takahiro and Yoshika didn't know what Rina was doing with these surgical spirits, but they bought them to support her. They would return home with these bottles, and Takahiro would barely open Rina's door to tuck the bottle in before Rina took it. Rina would never give them her empty bottle after the door closed. The bottle went in and stayed. Takahiro and Rina appeared to fight on the 18th of August, 2018. Yoshika was in the kitchen when she saw Takahiro sitting against Rina's bedroom door having a quiet conversation. Takahiro stood up, turned around, and yelled into the door. I said, your soul was insufficient. After Rina replied, Takahiro said, no, please. He seemed to be pleading with Rina to reconsider. Takahiro opened Rina's bedroom door and walked inside before Yoshika could ask him what was wrong, and the house went silent. The room was too scary for Yoshika to enter. She stayed in the kitchen and listened. It was quiet for 15 minutes. Takahiro left Rina's bedroom and closed the door, looking calm. Yoshika looked over and asked what was going on. Takahiro would smile and tell Yoshika, "Rina's masterwork is almost done." Takahiro then asked Yoshika if she remembered Rina saying her master's work would require family help. However, she said, "We will know when to participate." Yoshika replied, "I remember." "Now is the time," Takahiro said. Takahiro told Yoshika to get more surgical spirits at the store. Yoshika followed him without question. They bought 3 times as much surgical spirits at the store. After they got home, Takahiro alone went into Rina's bedroom with surgical spirits. He closed the door and Yoshika sat in the kitchen for 10 minutes until Takahiro returned without the surgical spirits. He would approach Yoshika and say Rina is ready to reconcile. Sitting by the door and talking to her will let you help her create her masterwork. This news frustrated and relieved Yoshika. She never thought it fair that Rina had completely cut her off after her 2013 palm reading simian line joke. Rina also made Yoshika's life difficult for years. Yoshika had to give up her piano dreams, friends, and life goals to support Rina. Despite that, Yoshika missed Rina deeply. They used to be close. She wanted that relationship back. First, Yoshika sat against Rina's closed bedroom door and didn't say anything. Rina also said nothing. But then the floodgates opened and Yoshika began crying about how her and Rina's relationship had gone south and how she wanted to fix it. Now, when Yoshika would talk through the door to Rina, like when she was trying to open it to drop something off, Rina would usually start banging on something inside the room to tell her to stop and leave. Yoshika spent her time pouring her heart out to Rina through the door, but she noticed no pounding from inside. She was heard by Rina. Next day, Yoshika and Takahiro went to the store again and bought more surgical spirits to bring back to the house. This time, Yoshika was allowed to enter Rina's bedroom. Rina was on the bed when Takahiro and Yoshika entered the dark bedroom. Takahiro showed Yoshika what to do as they approached her. The final step of Rina's master's project. They had to rub Rina's body with surgical spirits. Yoshika didn't understand why they were doing this, but she respected Rina's plan and was happy to be part of creating this master work, so she didn't ask any questions. After rubbing alcohol on Rina for about 10 minutes, the brother and sister left, closed the door, and Yoshika sat down against the door and poured her heart out to Rina again. It was very therapeutic. In many ways, Yoshika was happy again. She was finally fixing her relationship with Rina. Yoshika's daily routine changed over several weeks. After getting all these surgical spirits, she and her brother would rub them on Rina, and then Yoshika would chat with her through the door all day. All done. After Yoshika and Takahiro applied these surgical spirits to Rina's body on the 25th of September 2018, Yoshika told Rina she had a special surprise for her. Yoshika was in a good mood today because she was feeling good about her new relationship with her sister and because she and her brother usually didn't talk to the pharmacist who sold the surgical spirits because they tried to hide and make it clear they weren't talking. On this day, the pharmacist was talking to Yoshika. Yoshika decided to respond. Their conversation lacked substance. Finally, the pharmacist asked Yoshika why she was buying surgical spirits. Yoshika would say, "They are for my sister Rina, who needs more and more of them every day. She is working on something special, but we don't know what it is, but this is part of it, and we know it will be worth it." For Yoshika, who had little social contact, this conversation was great, even though it seemed pointless. She felt ready to do something special for Rina when she got home. After Yoshika and Takahiro left Rina's bedroom with surgical spirits, Yoshika surprised Rina. Yoshika went to the family piano near Rina's bedroom. Yoshika was nervous, but she sat on the bench, opened the lid, and touched the keys. Yoshika was surprised to learn that she would play the Waltz of the Flowers, a classical piece inspired by the composer's love for his sister. Yoshika thought this was the perfect song to perform in this house for Rina. She will know I adore her. Yoshika played the song, listening for Rina to bang something to stop her. Yet again, she did not. It was quiet. Yoshika played this lovely song. When it happened again, Yoshika waited for Rina to yell or be mad about playing loud music in the house. It was quiet, though. Yoshika felt close to her sister again, and she soon started crying with joy. But Yoshika heard a bang when she closed the piano lid. It wasn't from Rina's bedroom. Coming from the front door. Yoshika heard a scream outside the front door moments later. Police speak. Before Yoshika could open the door, her mother ran there. She opened all 4 locks, but only opened one crack and yelled at the police to leave. Police were pushing on the door to get the mother out of the way. Yoshika moved over and looked through the crack and saw more than 2 police officers. It was an army of police, firefighters, and EMTs. There was an ambulance. Soon, the police officer yelling, "Open up," pushed and opened the door completely. A uniformed horde flooded the home. As soon as the officers entered the house, they opened every door as if looking for something. Finally, they opened Rina's bedroom door. Once they did, Yoshika watched the officers stop at the doorway. They cursed, yelled, and looked away. Officers then entered Rina's bedroom. 1 minute later, they started talking on the radio. Emergency medical personnel entered the house with a stretcher. After entering Rina's bedroom, Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother watched the stretcher return with officers and technicians. Rina was stretchered, and she looked awful. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, and her skin was translucent. She looked like a skeleton. The events in that family's home became international news. And not because Rina was secretly painting a masterpiece in her bedroom. The facts are here. Rina stopped eating in April 2018. She said she only needed her visionary soul nourished. Because of her visionary soul, she didn't need food. Yoshika overheard Takahiro telling Rina, "Only your soul how?" He was trying to figure out how Rina's soul would sustain her. It made no sense. 4 months later, on August 18, Yoshika heard her brother and sister talking through the bedroom door again. Except today, Takahiro stood up and yelled through the door, "I told you your soul was not enough," sounding like he was fighting with Rina. He then broke into Rina's bedroom and stayed there in silence for 15 minutes before calmly telling Yoshika that Rina is almost done with her master's work and we just need to get her more surgical spirits. Takahiro actually yelled at Rina through the door because she wasn't responding to his attempts to talk to her. His suspicion was that she wasn't eating. He shouted at her and barged into her room to find Rina unresponsive. No movement, no speech. He stood there, unsure what to do. As Takahiro stands there, he realizes the time. Get involved now. Takahiro left the bedroom with Yoshika and went to the pharmacy to get more surgical spirits. When they returned, Takahiro alone covered Rina's bedroom in these spirits. Because she had asked him to do that before, and he thought she needed more spirits now that she couldn't talk or move. Her visionary soul will nourish her while she finishes this master work. For the next month, Takahiro and Yoshika applied these spirits to Rina's body, believing they were helping her finish her masterwork. On September 25, while Yoshika and Takahiro were buying more spirits at the pharmacy, the pharmacist finally spoke to Yoshika because he had noticed that these surgical spirits smelled bad every time they came in. It smelled terrible when they arrived this day. The pharmacist finally asked Yoshika what these surgical spirits were for. Yoshika gave this weird answer about how the spirits were for her sister and she was working on her masterwork in her bedroom and it would be worth it. After Yoshika and Takahiro left that day, the pharmacist was so alarmed that he called the police. The police found Rina not building a masterwork in her bedroom when they arrived at the family home. She had been dead in bed for 6 weeks. Rina died around August 18 when Takahiro entered and found her unresponsive. So Yoshika and Rina never reconciled. Why Takahiro told Yoshika that Rina was ready to reconcile with him is unknown. Rina was dead at the time and would not have said anything. Yoshika had fake heart-to-hearts with her sister through the door and played her fake music. From August 18th until September, when the police broke into their home, Yoshika and Takahiro spent nearly every day rubbing this strange medical alcohol on their dead sister's body because they believed she wanted it. Alcohol was actually mummifying her body. The conditions inside that room must have been unimaginable to outsiders in the weeks before the police discovery. Yasutake family saw it as their reality. Because of their prolonged isolation, their minds had adapted to a different set of rules. They didn't see a medical emergency when Rina stopped talking. A spiritual shift occurred. They did not see death when she froze. They saw her genius in action. The bulk surgical spirits they bought were chemical preservatives. The body decomposes naturally after death. But Takahiro and Yoshika were constantly applying this highly concentrated alcohol to her skin, drying out the tissues before the bacteria could break them down. They were unknowingly performing an ancient preservation ritual. They kept her skin, hair, and body from breaking down. This showed them the masterwork was working. They felt validated every day when they entered that dark room and saw that her body was not changing normally. They believed these surgical spirits connected her soul to the physical world. Emergency personnel entered that bedroom to a strong surgical spirit smell that stung their eyes. But behind that chemical smell was the smell of a human body kept in a dark room for over a month. Bedroom walls were covered in Rina's art. Strange, complex paintings that moved in the dim light. The floor was covered in philosophy, language, and art books. Rina's bed was in the center. Her body was properly cared for, and she wore her usual clothes. She had brushed her hair and cleaned her face. She was absolutely skeletal. Her skin had tightened over her bones, making her a mummy. Police officers entering that room were unprepared for what they saw. They anticipated a sibling dispute or neglect. They were surprised to find 3 people living with a preserved corpse as if it were alive. The discovery shocked the entire department immediately. To document the scene, forensic investigators had to wear protective gear due to the biological and chemical fumes in the cottage. The town of Helmsley was stunned. They had lived with this quiet family for years. They had seen the brother and sister walking to the shops with collars up and heads down. They knew they were private, but never imagined something so bizarre and tragic was happening behind those locked doors. Local news covered the story, and national and international journalists visited the quiet village. Satellite trucks and reporters flooded the stone cottages and narrow streets, trying to figure out how this could have happened in such a peaceful place. Rina's death investigation was complicated. The first step for forensic pathologists was to determine her death date and manner. However, her body was preserved by surgical spirits, making an autopsy difficult. Normal toxicological tests were difficult due to her tissue chemical changes. After weeks of careful examination, medical examiners found no physical violence or trauma on her body. Strangulation, defensive wounds, and poison were absent. Only that her body had run out of energy made sense. She starved herself to death for spiritual mastery. Attorneys had to decide what to charge the family. The UK has a charge for this. Preventing a proper burial. A lengthy prison sentence is possible for this serious crime. Yoshika Takahiro and their 80-year-old mother were arrested and charged with this crime. However, as the legal process progressed, everyone involved realized this was no ordinary criminal case. The family did not act like body hiders. They were honest in interviews. They were completely honest about their actions. They detailed how they cared for Rina, rubbed surgical spirits on her body, and waited for her to finish her master's work to the police. She wasn't mentioned in the past. They felt Rina's presence. The court ordered extensive psychological evaluations for Yoshika Takahiro and their mother. These psychiatrists interviewed one of their most unusual cases. They found no malice in the family. They did not hurt Rina or hide her death for financial gain. They did it out of love and devotion. But their love was filtered through shared delusions. Psychologists diagnosed the family with folie à trois, a rare form of shared delusional disorder. This psychological condition involves transferring delusions from one person to close friends. In this household, Rina was dominant. Her genius, artistic talent, and charisma allowed her to control her siblings and mother. When Rina developed delusions about her soul supporting her body, her family didn't question her. They trusted her completely. Being so isolated from society meant no one to check their reality. No one to tell them their beliefs were impossible. Rina retreated deeper into her room over time, and the family protected her. No one questioned her rules. Communication devices were removed. Her invented language was taught. Lived in complete silence. They formed a belief loop. That loop continued after Rina died. Instead, it adapted. Takahiro could not believe his sister, the genius who would create the greatest art in history, was dead. His mind came up with an explanation for her survival. Simply moving on with her master's work. Since Yoshika and their mother were in the same closed loop, they accepted his explanation immediately. The court hearings were solemn. The family appeared fragile and out of touch with courtroom reality. They didn't understand why they were charged. They only followed Rina's instructions. They looked after her. They shielded her. They saw legal proceedings as another outside obstacle they had spent decades avoiding. The defense claimed that trying this family would be a miscarriage of justice. They claimed that the family members were not criminally liable because their mental illness prevented them from understanding Rina's death. After reviewing psychiatric reports, the prosecution agreed. They realized imprisoning this family was pointless. They had no criminal intent or public danger. So the judge dropped all charges against Yoshika Takahiro and their mother. The court found them mentally unfit to stand trial. They were placed with local mental health services instead of jail. I tried to gently bring them back to reality so they could accept Rina's death and grieve her properly. After years, it's unclear if mental health professionals succeeded. Family returned to Helmsley's small stone cottage. 4 locks remain on the door. Light-blocking shades remain. Their neighbors rarely see them. Sometimes they see Takahiro or Yoshika walking to the store to buy groceries with their heads down and collars up, as usual. They no longer buy surgical spirits in bulk because police and medical authorities monitor them. However, they remain quiet and isolated. Many in the village believe the family has never accepted Rina's death. They believe the family speaks Rina's invented language in that quiet, clean cottage. They maintain absolute silence at home. The empty bedroom makes them think Rina is gone, or that her spirit is still working on the master work that will be revealed. The Yasutaka's tragedy is isolation. It shows how easily the mind can lose touch with reality when isolated. It shows how love and devotion can turn disturbing and bizarre in the dark. Yoshika Yasutake once filled concert halls with her music. Brother Takahiro could create worlds with words. Sister Rina was a genius with the world at her feet. They were all consumed by the darkness of a single room in a quiet English village. The Helmsley cottage silently commemorates this strange case. People who pass it on their way to the shops or castle ruins often wonder what's inside the windows. They wonder if this silence Rina demanded will last forever, or if the music will return. Death cannot break the family's bond. a shared faith that defied nature and society. The story ends with a quiet return to normal, not a dramatic confession or trial. A family hiding a secret only they know. They wait forever in their silent fortress for a master work that has reached its tragic end. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. One afternoon in February of 2007, a man walked nervously across an icy parking lot. He was heading towards the front door of a police station in Merrillville, Indiana. This man had just been arrested, and he was being brought in for processing. But he had this hope, a strong belief, really, that he wouldn't be there for long. He thought he'd be allowed to leave almost immediately. And that's because he had a piece of information, a huge piece of information, about a murder case that had been cold for 4 years. He was planning to trade this information for his own freedom. And even though he was a little nervous it might not work, deep down, he was pretty confident it would. Because this wasn't just some small tip he was offering. This was a bombshell that would blow the whole case wide open. On the afternoon of the 17th of April, 2003, a 33-year-old man named John Parker Jr. was sitting at his desk. He was in his office at J&J Parker Industries, right there in Merrillville, Indiana. He was trying to get through a stack of paperwork, and he was really hoping for just a few minutes of uninterrupted quiet time to finish it. In John's world, finding a few quiet minutes was a rare thing. John was the owner of J&J, which was a consulting company. They trained people on how to sell high-end vacuums. Now, vacuums might not sound very glamorous, but John's company was incredibly successful, and running it was a massive amount of work. He was constantly on his feet, managing a team of about 25 employees, solving one problem after another. He almost never got a quiet moment to sit down and do things like paperwork. And even though John would sometimes complain about how busy he was, the truth is, he loved it. He had always been a hard worker, a real go-getter. He actually started out in the vacuum business as a door-to-door salesman. And back then, everyone told him there was no real money to be made in vacuums. But John was determined to prove them wrong, and he did. He was so good at sales, so naturally talented, that he made his first $1 million by the time he was just 30 years old. And now, just a few years later, he had his own company that taught other people how to be just as successful as he was. But right now, as John was trying to focus on his paperwork, his desk phone started ringing. He let out a little sigh and picked it up. It was his wife, Judy. She was calling to remind him about their daughter's homework. She'd left it in his office a couple of days ago, and Judy asked him if he could please remember to bring it home with him that night. John was about to tell her that this was the second time she had reminded him about the homework today, but he caught himself. He decided not to say anything. Because right now, things between them were actually pretty good. Their relationship was on solid ground, and he didn't want to do anything to mess that up. John and Judy had been married for 10 years. She wasn't just his partner in life, she was his partner in business, too. Judy was the second J in J&J Parker Industries. Together, they were raising 4 kids. To the outside world, John and Judy looked like the perfect power couple. They were happy, successful, and had a beautiful family. But the reality was a lot more complicated than that. About a year before this, Judy had had an affair. And at the time, John had been completely devastated. But he really loved his family, and he wanted to give their marriage another chance. They had been living in Michigan when the affair happened, and they both agreed that moving the business to Merrillville, Indiana, which was where John was originally from, would be a good way to get a fresh start. And so far, it seemed like they had made the right decision. The business was thriving, things were looking up for them financially, and most importantly, John and Judy were getting along again. They were trying to rebuild their trust. So, instead of getting annoyed at his wife for the reminder about the homework, he just said, sure. He told her he'd grab it and that he would see her later for their date night. As soon as John hung up the phone with Judy, there was a knock on his office door. His office manager, a man named Barry Jones, came charging in holding a bunch of files. Barry dropped them right on John's desk and said he was sorry to interrupt, but he needed a signature right away. It was the final termination paperwork for an employee John had recently fired. The employee's name was Derek Hall. About a week earlier, John had made the tough decision to let Derek go. It wasn't anything personal against Derek, he just wasn't a good fit for the company. He couldn't seem to keep up with the sales quotas, and John had very high standards for his employees. That's how he'd become a millionaire in the first place, by setting a high bar and meeting it. But Derek hadn't taken the firing well. He seemed to think it was John's fault, that John had a personal vendetta against him. Derek had actually shown up at the J&J office and made a big scene in the parking lot. He was yelling that John had shorted him hundreds of dollars on his last paycheck. John had tried to calm the situation down, to talk to Derek rationally, but Derek had gotten physical and actually attacked him. It got so bad that the police had to be called to separate them before it got any uglier. In the end, John had just paid Derek the money he was demanding. He didn't want the drama. He just wanted the whole thing to be over with. And that's why, right now, he was quickly scribbling his signature on the termination paperwork and handing it back to Barry. He was hoping that this would be the absolute last time he would ever have to see or even think about Derek Hall again. After work, around 6 p.m., John drove home. His house was only about a 15-minute drive from the office. When he got inside, he heard Judy call down from upstairs. She said she'd be ready for their date night soon. He yelled back that there was no rush, and he meant it. You see, just a little over an hour earlier, his older brother David had met him at the office. The two of them had gone to a buffet together for a late lunch. So, John wasn't really hungry at all anymore. But he knew that this dinner with Judy was more about spending time together and reconnecting than it was about the food. So, he wasn't going to say anything about his earlier meal. John walked into the living room where his 4 kids were watching TV. There was his one 7-year-old daughter, Christina, her one 5-year-old brother, Daniel, and their 2 younger sisters. The 2 older kids were going to babysit the younger ones tonight, so he and Judy could have their night out. But when John tried to start a conversation with them, both Christina and Daniel just gave him the cold shoulder. They barely even looked at him. Now, for any other parent, this might just seem like typical teenage behavior. But for John, it felt more complicated than that. Christina and Daniel were actually his stepkids. John had been in their lives since they were very young, and he had always considered himself to be their real dad. He had tried so hard to be involved. He coached Daniel's baseball team, he went to all the school concerts, he never missed a parent-teacher conference. But recently, his relationship with both of them had changed. It had become strained. And frankly, both kids had started acting out a lot more. Christina was repeatedly throwing parties at their house whenever he and Judy were gone. And Daniel was becoming more and more combative. He was hanging out with a group of friends who seemed to be constantly in trouble with the law. And this was creating a lot of conflict in the house, specifically between them and John. Because John was the one who tried to enforce the rules and discipline them. Judy, on the other hand, always seemed to play the good cop, letting things slide. But John knew that trying to force a conversation with them right now wouldn't get him anywhere. So he just sat down quietly, and they all watched TV in silence until Judy came downstairs and announced she was ready to go. Hours later, just before 10 p.m., John and Judy left the restaurant. They got in their car and started driving back towards John's office at J&J Parker Industries. The office was located in an office park in a pretty secluded area. The two of them had had a really nice dinner. They had talked and seemed to be connecting. But during the meal, Christina had called. She wanted to know where that homework was, the homework John was supposed to bring home. And John, feeling a wave of embarrassment, suddenly realized that despite all of Judy's reminders, the same ones he was getting annoyed by earlier, he had completely forgotten the homework at the office. So that's why they were here now, making a stop to pick it up on their way home. John pulled the car into the parking lot, and they both got out. When they walked into the building, they found that the office manager, Barry, was still there, hard at work. John wasn't too surprised by this. Things have been really busy lately. They were planning new training seminars and trying to find a new hire to replace Derek. And Barry was the one in charge of keeping everything organized. John didn't feel too bad about Barry putting in all these extra hours. It was his job after all, and the whole company relied on him to make sure nothing important slipped through the cracks. So, when Barry mentioned to John that he was actually thinking about heading home soon, John told him no. At that same moment, John saw Judy grab the homework off his desk. She gave a little wave and then hustled back out to the car. As he watched her go, John turned back to Barry and told him he was sorry, but he really needed him to stay and finish what he was working on. It was important. But then, to try and soften the blow of this bad news, John offered Barry his leftovers from dinner. He had a basically untouched, full meal in a to-go box since he hadn't been hungry. Barry kind of grumbled about having to stay, but he said he would take the food if John was offering. So, John nodded and went back outside to the car to get it for him. Moments later, John was back at the car where Judy was waiting in the passenger seat. He opened the back door and picked up the styrofoam to-go box. When Judy looked over her shoulder at him, he told her he was just going to run the food back inside to Barry. She just shrugged and said, "Fine," then turned back around to face the front. But right at that exact moment, as John was closing the car door, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the concrete coming up right behind him. But before he even had a chance to turn around and see who it was, he heard a deafening bang. Judy heard the bang too. It was immediately followed by a second one. Her instincts took over and she ducked down in her seat. Then she looked back towards John just in time to see him fall hard to the ground. Before she could even process what was happening, before she could scream or move, she saw a person. They were dressed in dark clothes and wearing a mask. The person crouched over John's body for just a few seconds, and then they sprinted away from the car, running towards the main road and disappearing into the darkness. Judy scrambled out of the car and ran to John's side, screaming his name. But he just lay there, on the cold pavement, completely still. And then she saw it. A huge pool of dark blood was spreading out from underneath his head. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Judy ran back to the office door and screamed at the top of her lungs for Barry to call the police. By about 10:30 that night, the parking lot at J&J Parker Industries was a swarm of flashing blue and red lights. It was overrun with police officers and crime scene technicians. Among them was a man named Detective Donald Toth. He'd been with the Maryville Police Department for 21 years. When he first got the call, dispatch had only told him there had been a shooting. But as soon as he arrived on the scene, a first responder pulled him aside and told him that it was actually a fatality. The victim was 33-year-old John Parker Jr. He had been identified by the other two witnesses who were still at the scene. The first responder also explained that before they spoke to any witnesses, they had tried to find John's wallet to identify him. But the wallet wasn't in any of his pockets, and it wasn't in the car. When Toth heard that, his first immediate thought was that this was probably a robbery. But as soon as he walked over and got a closer look at John, he immediately started to question that theory. John was lying on his back behind his parked car. And the first thing Toth noticed was that John was wearing a lot of very nice, very expensive jewelry. He had gold and diamond rings on his fingers, a heavy bracelet on his wrist, and a very expensive-looking Rolex watch. Also, this office park was in a remote area. It wasn't close to anything. It just didn't seem like the kind of place where a random mugger would hang out hoping to find a victim. Toth started to wonder if maybe the killer took the wallet just to throw the police off, to make them think it was a robbery. Because the longer he looked at John's body, the more signs he saw that this was likely a planned and efficient execution. John didn't have any visible defensive wounds, which suggested he never saw it coming. And when Toth carefully used a gloved hand to move John's head to the side, he saw the gunshot wound. It was right behind his ear. Toth had actually worked as a paramedic before he became a detective, so he knew from experience that a shot like that had likely killed John instantly. It also meant that John had his back turned to the shooter when he died. There was an open styrofoam to-go container of food on the ground and a set of car keys right next to John's body. The way they were placed on the pavement made it look like John had probably been holding them when he fell. If John had been in some kind of altercation, like a struggle with a thief or a fight that ended in murder, the scene would have been much messier. As far as Toth could tell, the killer had simply walked up to John while he was distracted at his car, aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and then, after John was on the ground, grabbed his wallet and just left. This also meant the killer very likely had not been at the scene long enough to leave behind much evidence. All Toth and his team could find were 2 shell casings on the ground. He doubted they would find any useful footprints or any DNA. And when Toth spoke to some of the other officers at the scene, he learned they had already done a sweep of the entire office park. They had looked in all the dumpsters, checked the bushes, and even looked on the roofs of the buildings. But they hadn't found anything. And there were no security cameras or surveillance systems anywhere in the area. So, as Toth stood there in the middle of the parking lot, watching his officers continue to search, he had a sinking realization. He was now the lead detective on a murder case with virtually no forensic evidence. That was a daunting position to be in, but he reminded himself that he did have at least 2 witnesses. About an hour later, Toth was sitting across a table from John Parker's wife, Judy, inside an interrogation room at the Merrillville police station. He'd learned a few basic things about Judy already. She was the one who had told Barry to call the police, and she was with John when he was shot. He also knew that as the spouse of a murder victim, she was automatically his #1 suspect. Now, Toth didn't really think Judy was the one who had pulled the trigger. But given how clean the crime scene was, he knew it was possible this was a professional hit. And if that was the case, Judy could have been the one who hired the killer. But as Toth started to speak with Judy, he began to waver on that theory. She couldn't stop crying. It was making it hard for her to even get her words out. And when she did manage to speak, her voice was slow and quiet, like it was taking every ounce of her energy just to say anything at all. She did manage to give Toth the timeline of the evening. She told him how she and John had gone out to dinner for their date night, and then they had stopped by the office afterward because one of their daughters had left some homework there. She said the office manager, Barry, had been at the office, and that after she went back to the car, she knew that Barry and John were still talking inside. Then, at some point, John had left the building and come out to the car to get his dinner leftovers. She said at that time she had turned away from him for a moment, and that's when she heard the 2 loud shots. When she turned back around, she saw John fall. And then she saw the figure in dark clothes bending over John before they ran away. However, once Judy finished telling her story about what had happened that night, all the events that led up to the shooting, something in her demeanor shifted. The shakiness in her voice, all the raw grief that had been pouring out of her, it just vanished. In its place, Judy became very stern, very hardened. She looked directly at Toth, right into his eyes, and she said, "You better find the person who did this and bring them to justice." And when Toth saw the sudden change, he almost got goosebumps. It was such a drastic departure from how she had been acting just moments before. And he thought to himself, either she is a fantastic actress and this is all just a big performance, meaning she was involved, or this is genuine. She's a grieving widow who is in shock and doesn't know how to process the fact that her husband has just been murdered in front of her. At some point during the interview, Toth asked Judy if she could think of anyone, absolutely anyone, who might have wanted to hurt John. Judy seemed to think about it for a second, but eventually she just shook her head and said, no. She said that John was an incredible husband and a wonderful father. She said they had a great marriage that they had both worked very hard on and that everyone at work respected him. But then, something seemed to click in her memory. She frowned and said, actually, there was someone from work who didn't like John. His name was Derek, and John had fired him recently. She explained that after the firing, Derek had come back to J&J and started a physical fight with John right there in the parking lot. When Toth heard that, he perked up. A disgruntled former employee was definitely someone he needed to talk to. Toth was scheduled to speak with the office manager, Barry Jones, right after he was done with Judy. So he figured he could ask Barry about that incident as well. Now, Toth wasn't ready to completely rule Judy out as a suspect. He still needed to check her finances and talk to her friends and family about the state of her marriage. But for now, he didn't see any reason to hold her. So he told Judy that she was free to go home and be with her kids, to grieve, and that they would be in touch. Then Toth got up and he left to go to another interrogation room where Barry was waiting for him. The following morning, Toth walked up a flight of porch steps. He was at the home of Derek Hall, the ex-employee that John Parker had recently fired. The night before, Toth had spoken to John's office manager, Barry Jones. Barry had confirmed what Judy had said about Derek. He verified that after Derek was fired, there had been a huge, ugly fight at the office between Derek and John, and that Derek was the one who had started it. It was really the only useful piece of information Barry had given him. Barry claimed that during the actual shooting, he had been in the bathroom, so he hadn't heard or seen anything at all until he heard Judy screaming for him. But the lead on Derek was solid enough for now. And it wasn't just Barry and Judy who thought Derek might have killed John. Just before coming here, Toth had also spoken to John's brother David. David was incredibly devastated and absolutely furious about his brother's death. And David had also pointed the finger directly at Derek. So Toth was very eager to meet this man, Derek, a man that 3 different people claimed could be a killer. Toth reached the top of the steps and knocked on the front door. When Derek answered, Toth introduced himself and explained why he was there. Derek seemed completely stunned by the news of John's murder, but he immediately let Toth inside. Moments later, Toth was sitting across from Derek in his living room. And even though Derek seemed very uncomfortable and nervous, he told Toth he was actually glad the detective was there. He said he really wanted to give his side of the story. Derek explained that when he started working at J&J, he was given way more work than he had ever expected. And when he couldn't keep up with the workload, he was fired. And then, to make matters worse, John had shorted him $400 on his final paycheck. So, he had gone back to J&J to get the money he felt he was owed. He admitted that it did lead to a physical confrontation, but he insisted they had only pushed each other a bit and that the whole thing had been resolved. He made it sound like it wasn't that big of a deal. But beyond that, Derek insisted that he could not have killed John because he had an alibi. He had spent the entire evening of the murder at a friend's house playing video games. He gave Toth his friend's phone number and said, "Go ahead, call him. He'll confirm everything." Toth tried not to look too disappointed as he wrote down the number. But if this alibi checked out, he would have to rule Derek out as a suspect. Now, it was still possible that Derek had hired someone to kill John, but to Toth, that seemed unlikely. If Derek was that upset over $400, it didn't seem probable that he would have the kind of extra cash needed to pay a hitman. But as Toth left Derek's house and got back into his car, he decided the interview wasn't a total waste of time after all. Because talking to Derek made him realize something. He needed to focus more on John's business life. According to John's brother David, John had gotten rich very young and had built his company very quickly. And in Toth's experience, people who achieve that kind of rapid success often step on a few toes to get to the top. The next day, Toth walked down a hallway at the precinct, heading towards an interrogation room. He had already confirmed Derek's alibi with his friend, so he had to move on to other suspects. And that was fine with Toth because he was about to sit down with his new prime suspect, who happened to be one of his original witnesses. It was John's office manager, Barry Jones. The day before, Toth had gone back to the J&J Parker Industries office. He made it a point to speak to every single employee about John. And what he found out was that, by all accounts, John was a great boss. He pushed his employees to be their best, but he worked just as hard, if not harder, himself. The employees also said that Judy was an essential part of the company and that the Parkers, as a team, were very well respected in the world of vacuum sales. But there was also some office gossip. And this gossip said that their marriage was not as happy as it seemed. It was apparently common knowledge around the office that Judy was having an affair with Barry Jones. A few employees had even claimed they had caught them having sex at the office. Now, neither Barry nor Judy had mentioned any of this the first time Toth had spoken to them. So now, Toth had no idea if anything they had told him was true. Barry could have been lying about being in the bathroom. He could have been the shooter. Or maybe he and Judy were working together and they were both lying to cover their tracks. Toth was leaning towards the second option, because he had also found out that Judy was set to get a very big payday from the death of her husband. She was the beneficiary of a $1 million life insurance policy. And on top of that, John's general estate was worth around $2 million. Maybe Toth thought she and Barry wanted to take John's money and run off together. So when Toth walked into the interrogation room, his plan was to basically tell Barry that the investigation was over, that they had caught him in a lie, and they knew what he did. But when Toth sat down and confronted him, Barry did not act like a guilty man who had been cornered. He was charismatic and confident. He said the affair was just baseless office gossip. He claimed he was just good friends with Judy and that they worked together closely. Barry insisted that he, Judy, and John were like a family. In fact, he said he was currently living with one of Judy's cousins who was visiting from Texas. Now, Toth didn't really believe a word Barry was saying. But even though he kept pressing him, Barry stuck to his story. And eventually, Toth had to let him go. Without any physical evidence, it was just Barry and Judy's word against the word of the employees. And even if they were having an affair, that wasn't enough to prove they had conspired to murder John. On Monday, April 21st, 4 days after John's murder, Toth was at his desk. He was rereading the notes from Barry and Judy's interviews for what felt like the millionth time. He was still trying to find a concrete way to link Judy and Barry to John's murder before he approached Judy about it again. But so far, other than the office rumors, he hadn't found anything. And he didn't really have any other leads. He had learned that the shell casings found at the scene were from a .25 caliber gun. That was useful information to have, but it wasn't going to help him narrow down his suspect list. Toth leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He'd been working on this case non-stop since Thursday night, and he was completely exhausted. He was starting to think about maybe going home and getting some rest when he heard a light knock on his office door. An officer poked his head in and told Toth there was someone on line 3 with a tip, and it sounded like a good one. Toth picked up his phone. The person on the other end of the line explained that they were a police officer as well from a nearby town. They said they had heard about John Parker's murder on the news and realized they had some information that might be relevant. It turned out that about 6 months earlier, this officer had been called to a local juvenile detention facility to take a report. The staff there had done a random search of the kids' belongings and found that 2 of them had a lot of cash, over $200. Having cash was against the rules, and when the kids were asked where they got it, they said it was a payment for a hit on John Parker. That stunned Toth. But it wasn't nearly as shocking as what the officer said next. These 2 kids claimed that the person who had arranged this hit was a former high school classmate of theirs named Daniel Hicks. Toth couldn't believe what he was hearing. Daniel Hicks was John's own 5-year-old stepson. Toth had started to think that this murder could be a professional hit, but it had never even occurred to him that the hit could be linked to John's own family, let alone a child. The officer on the phone explained that they hadn't taken the kid's claim very seriously at the time, so no one had ever notified John's family or spoken to Daniel about it. Toth didn't have to say it, but this was a massive screw-up on their part. But he wasn't focused on placing blame. He was focused on figuring out what had happened. So, Toth got the names of the 2 kids with the cash from the officer. As soon as he hung up, he immediately sent some of his own officers to track those kids down. Then, Toth put in a call to Judy. He needed to bring her son Daniel in for an interview. And since he was a minor, Judy was going to have to come with him. Late that same night, actually after midnight, Toth was once again inside an interrogation room with Judy. But this time, instead of answering questions herself, Judy was sitting in a chair at the back of the room watching. Her son, Daniel, was sitting at the table with Toth and a few other detectives. Toth had spoken to Judy briefly right before this, and she had seemed genuinely shocked to hear that her son had apparently asked someone to kill John. She told Toth there had to be some kind of mistake, and she was happy for the police to speak to Daniel directly because she was sure that would clear this whole mess up. Toth had made a strategic decision not to ask Judy about the affair with Barry at that moment. She was being very cooperative by letting them speak to her son, and he didn't want to upset her and risk her changing her mind. They also hadn't been able to locate the two kids that Daniel had supposedly hired yet, so right now, Daniel was the only one he could question. And now, watching Daniel, Toth could see he was acting like a typical young person who was in trouble. He looked nervous. He was blinking a lot, and he kept wringing his hands like he wasn't really sure what to do with them. So, Toth decided his best approach was just to be direct. Maybe he could scare the truth out of Daniel. So, right off the bat, he told Daniel that he knew about the murder-for-hire plot, and he told him to explain himself. And to Toth's surprise, Daniel took a deep breath and then said it was true. He admitted that he had paid two of his friends some money he had saved up from his allowance because he hated his stepdad. He said John was always on his case, always yelling at him, and Daniel just wanted it to stop. But Daniel insisted that he didn't want John to die. He was adamant that he had just asked his friends to teach John a lesson, to beat him up. Toth thought about this. It was possible that Daniel was telling the truth, and that the two kids in the detention center had either lied about the murder part or had decided on their own to kill John. But that felt a little far-fetched. Why would these kids lie and get themselves into even more trouble? Toth thought it was much more likely that Daniel was the one who was lying. And Toth was not about to let Daniel go anywhere until he found out for sure. So, he told Daniel and Judy that he was sorry, but they were going to have to take Daniel into custody. Then, Toth called some officers into the room to make the arrest. As he left, he could hear Judy and Daniel sounding completely shocked and protesting behind him. At this point, even though Toth had been up all night and was completely exhausted, he actually felt more alert than he had in days. It finally felt like they were making real progress on this case. So, instead of going home to get some rest, he went back to his office, poured himself a cup of coffee, and kept on working. On the 15th of May, 2003, almost a month after John Parker's murder, Detective Don Toth sat at his desk. He was reading over the copy for a flyer and making some last-minute changes to it. So far, it said that the police were looking for information about John Parker's murder, and it offered a reward to anyone who came forward with a tip. Toth planned to pass these flyers out all over town the next day, hoping the public could give him a new lead. It was kind of a desperate move, because while this case had seemed so close to being solved just a few weeks ago, now it was pretty much dead in the water. It had taken the police a while, but they had finally located both of the kids from the detention center, the ones Daniel had supposedly hired. And the kids admitted to meeting with Daniel and taking his money. But it turned out there was just no way they were the actual murderers. One of them had been thousands of miles away in Las Vegas on the night John was killed, and the other had been locked up in a juvenile detention facility. So, since Toth couldn't prove that the assassins Daniel hired had actually killed anyone, he'd had to let Daniel go. But that didn't mean Daniel was innocent. Those two kids had insisted that Daniel did ask for John to be killed, not just beat up. So Daniel was lying about that part. And Toth didn't think that someone who wanted to kill his father had just suddenly changed his mind. But since Toth knew that Daniel was at home babysitting his younger siblings at the exact time of John's murder, Toth figured he'd likely just gotten somebody else to do it for him. But Toth couldn't just keep questioning Daniel. Judy had hired a lawyer, and they were now refusing to let Toth question any of the family members at all. And that was incredibly frustrating because Toth wasn't done with Judy either. Out of everyone involved, she benefited the most from John's death. She was the beneficiary on his life insurance, and she was very likely having an affair with his office manager, Barry. So maybe part of her motive was just to hide the affair from him. And then there was Barry. He was potentially having this affair with John's wife. He might have had his own motive to get rid of John to keep the affair a secret. He also definitely seemed to think that John was a pretty tough boss, so maybe he'd just had enough and was either complicit or actively involved in the murder. He was also at the scene of the crime right when it happened, and since there weren't any cameras, Toth couldn't actually confirm Barry's story about being in the bathroom. But at this point, Toth didn't have the evidence he needed to prove any of these suspects actually killed John or hired someone to do it. And he also didn't have enough evidence to eliminate them and narrow down his pool of suspects. Instead, Toth had just kept adding to it. Because, as of this week, he was also considering John's own brother, David, as a person of interest. A few days ago, some officers had been called to Judy's house because David had stopped by and gotten into a huge verbal fight with the family. And this wasn't the first time it had happened. Apparently, David had gone over there and threatened the family before. One time, he had even damaged their car. This kind of behavior could just mean that David was lashing out because he was grieving the loss of his brother. But it could also mean that he was erratic and potentially violent. Plus, he had been with John on the afternoon of the murder at that buffet. He knew that John was going to have dinner with his wife later, so he could have easily guessed that John, being the workaholic he was, would check in at the office after they were done eating. Toth sighed and took a break from looking at the flyer. His brain was fried. But he felt hopeful. He thought these flyers would give him the tip he desperately needed to finally break this case. And so, the next day, Toth and some other officers passed out the flyers all over town. But then, weeks went by with no tips. And even though Toth did eventually get a few responses to the flyers, none of them gave him any actual, usable evidence. So over the next few months, Toth spent his days in his office, poring over the case files again and again, looking for something he might have missed, maybe a witness they didn't interview, or a piece of evidence they had overlooked. But there was just nothing. And as the months turned into years, Toth had to turn his attention to other projects. And eventually, the John Parker murder case went cold. 4 years after John's murder, on an afternoon in February of 2007, Toth arrived at work for the day and headed to his office. He had never forgotten about the John Parker case, but he was no longer actively investigating it. In fact, all of his cases had been winding down because he was planning to retire in just a few months. But right before he actually got to his office door, a narcotics officer caught up to him in the hallway and asked for a word. The officer explained that he knew Toth wasn't on their narcotics team, but they had a warrant out for a man involved in one of their drug investigations. And they had realized that this man had some crossover with one of Toth's old homicide cases from 2003, the John Parker case. Toth stopped dead in his tracks. He immediately told the officer to go get that man into an interview room. And sure enough, later that day, Toth sat down with this man. He was very chatty and seemed extremely eager to talk. And the first thing this man did was explain that the person he lived with knew John Parker. And this person had admitted to him that they were directly involved in John's death. And when this man told Toth the name of this person, Toth couldn't believe it. He leaned back in his chair, feeling both a wave of relief and a deep sense of disturbance. He was relieved because he finally knew who John Parker's killer was. And he was disturbed because this case was now way more twisted than he had ever imagined. Based on the police investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to John Parker on the night of the 17th of April, 2003. At around 10 p.m., the killer crept slowly through the shadowy parking lot at J&J Parker Industries. They were wearing a mask and dark clothes, and they were carrying a .25 caliber gun. They could see John's car by the office entrance with Judy sitting inside of it, but she was not the killer's target. John was also near the car. He wasn't inside it. He was standing right outside one of the back car doors. The door was open, and he was rifling around inside the car, looking for something. As the killer stared at John, thinking about what they were about to do, they thought about who this man was, how controlling and selfish he was. He had made the killer's life a living hell, and now the killer was going to get their revenge. So, while John's back was still turned, the killer silently walked right up behind him. They raised the gun, aimed it at the back of his head, and they fired. It was a direct hit, right behind the ear. John fell so fast that when the killer fired a second time, the bullet just missed. Now, the killer had never murdered anyone before, so they were shocked by what they had just done. But they were jostled back to reality when they heard John's wife Judy yelling and screaming from inside the car. So, as quickly as they could, the killer grabbed John's wallet to make the police think this was a robbery gone wrong, and then they turned and sprinted off into the night. Much later that night, the killer waited at home until the person who had masterminded this whole thing arrived. This person gave the killer a hug and told them they had done a good job. The mastermind then took the gun, John's wallet, and the clothes the killer had worn during the murder and told the killer they were going to dispose of all of it. And the killer just listened, feeling a sense of relief. They trusted this mastermind more than anyone else in the entire world. Because after all, she was his mother. It would turn out that Judy had convinced her own 5-year-old son, Daniel, to murder his stepfather, her husband. Judy wanted to get out of her marriage with John, but she knew if she divorced him, she would have only gotten half of his estate and their business. With his death, she could get the whole thing. It turned out she had already tried to kill John before, just unsuccessfully. First, she had tried to poison him. When that didn't work, she had tried to hire a hitman herself. But that also failed. So, finally, she asked Daniel to help, promising him that he would get some of the money. She had also enlisted her daughter, Christina, who was the one who found the gun that was used to kill John. Daniel had actually tried to hire someone else for the job first, but then ultimately decided to do it himself. He used his younger siblings as an alibi, saying he was at home babysitting them all night. And the man who told all of this to the police was Christina's husband, who she had married 2 years after John's death. Once her husband gave the authorities the entire story, the police interrogated both Christina and Daniel, who eventually confessed to everything. Judy was convicted of murder and sentenced to 33 years in prison. Daniel got 23 years in prison for pulling the trigger. And Christina received 5 years for her part in the murder as well. In a tragic end to an already devastating story, Christina would die in 2013 from a drug overdose. Daniel was released from prison in 2017, and his mother Judy was released in 2022. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!